Chapter 5. The origin of humans' unconditionally selfless, altruistic, moral, instinctive self, or soul. Chapter 5 begins with a wonderfully evocative image of a bonobo, named Matata, cradling her adopted infant son, Kanzi. To its right is an equal sign, leading to Jeremy Griffith's tender drawing of the archetypal image of the Madonna and Child. Chapter 5.1 Summary. When the philosopher Immanuel Kant had the following words from his 1788 book Critique of Practical Reason inscribed on his tombstone, that there are two things which fill me with awe: the starry heavens above us and the moral law within us. And Charles Darwin wrote in his 1871 book The Descent of Man that the moral sense perhaps affords the best and highest distinction between man and the lower animals. Neither man was overstating the magnificence of our altruistic moral sense. Our moral instinctive self or soul, the voice or expression of which is our conscience, is a truly amazing phenomenon, for it provided the cooperative, unconditionally selfless love that created humanity. But, as amazing as our moral soul most certainly is, its very existence is also a cause for wonder, because it raises the baffling question of how on earth did humans acquire such an awe-inspiring, distinct from other animals, moral sense. For biologists especially, the great outstanding mystery has been how could the cold, selfish, competitive, gene-based natural selection process have possibly created such warm, unconditionally selfless, cooperative, loving instincts in us humans. While it may seem astonishing to suggest that what is now going to be presented is that most elusive of answers to this most intriguing of mysteries, that is, in fact, the case. This chapter contains nothing less than the truth about what it really means to be human. Chapter 5.2. How could humans have acquired their altruistic moral instincts? As evidenced in paragraphs 180 to 182, throughout our mythologies and in the work of our most profound thinkers, there is a recognition that our distant ancestors lived in a pre-conscious, pre-human condition afflicted, innocent, unconditionally selfless, genuinely altruistic, fully cooperative, universally loving, peaceful state. As the author Richard Heimberg's research into this collective memory of a Garden of Eden-like golden age in our species past found, as he wrote in his 1990 book, Memories and Visions of Paradise, every religion begins with the recognition that human consciousness has been separated from the divine source, that a former sense of oneness has been lost. Everywhere in religion and myth, there is an acknowledgement that we have departed from an original innocence. So yes, when Nikolai Berdyaev acknowledged in his 1931 book, The Destiny of Man, that the memory of a lost paradise of a golden age is very deep in man, he was expressing what we all intuitively know is the truth about our species' past innocent existence, as was the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau when he, almost 2 centuries earlier, wrote that nothing is more gentle than man in his primitive state. The origin of the words associated with our moral nature reveals this underlying awareness of the extraordinarily loving, ideal behaviour expecting, good and evil differentiating, sound nature of our instinctive self or psyche or soul, the voice or expression of which is our conscience. For instance, from the concise Oxford Dictionary, our conscience is defined as our moral sense of right and wrong, and our soul as the moral and emotional part of man, and as the animating or essential part of us, While, as mentioned in paragraphs 258 and 260, the Penguin Dictionary of Psychology's entry for psych reads, "The oldest and most general use of this term is by the early Greeks, who envisioned the psyche as the soul or the very essence of life." Indeed, as the early Greek philosopher Plato wrote about our innate, ideal, or godly behaviour expecting moral nature, we humans have knowledge both before and at the moment of birth of all absolute standards, of beauty, goodness, uprightness, holiness. Our souls exist before our birth. Our soul resembles the divine. When the philosopher Jean Fiske wrote about the existence of our moral nature in his 1874 book, Outlines of Cosmic Philosophy, he was similarly effusive. "We approve of certain actions and disapprove of certain actions quite instinctively. We shrink from stealing or lying as we shrink from burning our fingers. And while our moral instinctive self or soul will shrink from stealing or lying, it is not merely concerned with avoiding the ill treatment of others, it is also deeply concerned with ensuring their well-being. For instance, when the professional footballer Joe Delaney admitted that, 'I can't swim good, but I've got to save those kids,' just moments before plunging into a Louisiana pond and drowning in an attempt to rescue 3 boys, he was considering the welfare of others above that of his own. The truth is that everywhere we look, we see examples of humans behaving unconditionally selflessly, such as those who show charity to others less fortunate or sacrifice their lives for ethical principles. Indeed, now that we can explain the human condition, it becomes clear that since the human condition fully emerged some 2 million years ago, every generation of humans has had to suffer becoming self-corrupted in an unconditionally selfless effort to aid the accumulation of knowledge that would one day liberate humanity from the human condition. To borrow the words from the musical Man of La Mancha that were included in paragraph 68, every generation has altruistically marched into hell for a heavenly cause. Our species' unconditionally selfless moral nature is undoubtedly a wonderful phenomenon. However, as mentioned in chapter 3.7, Alexander Pope saw our awe-inspiring, best and highest distinction-deserving, divine-like absolute standards of beauty, goodness, uprightness, holiness, expecting, animating very essence of life, moral and emotional, essential part of us, in a very different light, pointing out that our nature is a sharp accuser but a helpless friend. And he was right in the sense that, as was made clear in that chapter, our ideal behaviour expecting moral conscience has been a sharp accuser but a helpless friend. It has criticised us aplenty when what we needed was redeeming understanding of our good and evil afflicted, corrupted or fallen present human condition, which we now at last have. Paradoxically, until we could explain our present soul-devastated, innocence-destroyed, angry, egocentric and alienated condition, we couldn't afford to face the truth that our awe-inspiring moral soul is our instinctive memory of an unconditionally selfless or loving past. And so we undermined its very existence. Yes, just as human condition avoiding mechanistic scientists argued that unconditional love was not appropriate for scientific study, in 2000 the psychologist Ronald Conway noted in the Australian newspaper that soul is customarily suspected in empirical psychology and analytical philosophy as a disreputable entity. But with a fully accountable human psychosis addressing and solving truthful explanation of the human condition now found, we can finally acknowledge what our soul is and most significantly heal our species' psychosis or soul illness. Yes, since psych means soul and osis, according to dictionary.com, means abnormal state or condition, we can at last ameliorate or heal our species' psychosis, its alienated, psychologically ill, abnormal state or condition. But recognition and resolution of the issue aside, the very great question that remained to be answered was how could we humans have possibly acquired such a distinct from other animals, awe-inspiring but sharp-accusing instinctive orientation in the first place? What is the biological origin of our species' extraordinary moral nature? Chapter 5.3 The Integration of Sexually Reproducing Individuals to Form the Species Individual. As was explained in some detail in chapters 4.4 to 4.6, while the gene-based system for developing the order of matter on Earth is powerfully effective, it is, after all, responsible for the great variety of life we see on Earth. It has one very significant limitation, which arises from the fact that each sexually reproducing individual organism has to struggle and selfishly compete for the available resources of food, shelter, territory, and the mating opportunities it requires if it is to successfully reproduce its genes. What this means is that integration and the unconditionally selfless cooperation that integration depends upon cannot normally develop between one sexually reproducing individual and another, which in turn means that integration beyond the level of the sexually reproducing individual, that is, the coming together or integration of sexually reproducing individuals to form a new, larger and more stable whole of sexually reproducing individuals, the species individual, can also not normally develop. Thus, it would appear that negative entropies, or God's development of order of matter on Earth, had come to a stop at the level of the sexually reproducing individual. The integration of the members of a species into the larger whole of the species individual could seemingly not be developed. What this means is that only a degree of cooperation and thus integration could be developed between the sexually reproducing individual members of a species before the competition between them became so intense that a dominance hierarchy had to be employed to contain the divisive competition. And, in fact, that is where most animal species are stalled in their ability to integrate. They could become integrated to a degree, what has been termed social, but not completely integrated into one new, larger organism or whole. Certainly, each sexually reproducing individual could be either temporarily, in the case of large animals like wolves, or permanently, in the case of small animals like ants and bees, elaborated, developed to become bigger, thus allowing greater integration of matter to occur within the sexually reproducing individual. But those elaborated units, the wolf pack and the ant and bee colonies, were, nevertheless, still engaged in competition with each other. It seemed that the integration of sexually reproducing members of a species, and thus the full integration of the members of a species into a species individual, could not be achieved. Negative entropy, or God, had seemingly developed as much order of matter on Earth as it could. However, this was not the case. The integration of matter hadn't come to an end, because a way was found by negative entropy, or God, to integrate the members of a species into the larger whole of the species individual. And, moreover, it was our ape ancestors who achieved this extraordinary step. Yes, as Moses recognized in his account of the emergence of the human condition in Genesis, we humans did once live in the image of God. We were once a fully cooperative, unconditionally selflessly behaved, completely integrated species. We did once live in the Garden of Eden-like state of original, cooperative, loving, innocent togetherness. Then we became conscious, took the fruit from the tree of knowledge, and, as a result of being disobedient, the term widely used in descriptions of Genesis 3, we fell from grace, derived from the title of Genesis 3, The Fall of Man, because we became divisively behaved sufferers of the human condition, supposedly deserving of being banished from the Edenic state of original innocent togetherness. Again, the definition of Edenic being the first home of Adam and Eve, a state of innocence, bliss, or ultimate happiness. Our divisive, non-integrative, seemingly ungodly, psychologically angry, egocentric, and alienated present corrupted condition meant that today you, God or integrative meaning, are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. Humans will have to live in a disconnected from the truth, meaningless, lost, extremely distressed state of alienation, and, as a result, I will be a restless wanderer on the earth. But we can now at last emerge from this state because we can finally explain and thus compassionately understand why we had to search for knowledge and suffer becoming corrupted. Here in the essay appear 3 photos. The first, a quintessential depiction of our species' instinctive self or soul's home in Africa, the metaphorical Garden of Eden, in which 4 or 5 species of wildlife stand peacefully in the tall grass of an acacia woodland. The second, a reproduction of Lucas Cranach's The Elders, circa 1526, Adam and Eve, and the third, a photo of the beaming faces of 4 African children. The caption reads, "We can still see the remnants of the time when our species lived in a pre-human condition-afflicted, innocent, Garden of Eden-like state in the happiness and togetherness of children." So the great question is, how did negative entropy or God achieve this amazing integration, this blessed, innocent and simple and calm and happy, pure state that Plato described, where there was no war or quarrelling, and where we dwelt naked in the open air and lay on the soft couches of grass, the time when, as Hesiod said, we were a golden race with calm, untroubled minds, unbridled by toil, and all willing shared the gathering of our hands. How did our human ancestors develop the fully integrated state of the species individual, the instinctive memory of which is our unconditionally selfless, genuinely altruistic, cooperative, loving, moral self or soul, and the voice or expression of which is our conscience? What is the biological origin of our species' extraordinary shrink from stealing or lying, got to save those kids, selflessly prepared to march into hell for a heavenly cause, moral sense? Chapter 5.4 Love Indoctrination. Ever since Charles Darwin published his Natural Selection explanation for the origins of the great variety of life on Earth in 1859, all manner of theories have been put forward to suggest how one species, namely our species, managed to defy the essential selfish nature of the natural selection process and develop unconditionally selfless moral instincts. Indeed, in response to the great build-up of anxiety in the world about the now desperate plight of the human race and the resulting urgent need for the relieving answers that are being presented in this book, especially answers to the questions of the origin of our species' moral nature and present human condition-afflicted lack of compliance with it, almost every edition of every science journal over the last 10 years has either presented or discussed a new theory that attempts to account for our moral sense. But of all these theories, a brief history of which will be presented in Chapter 6, only one provides the fully accountable and thus adequate, true explanation for the origins of our moral sense, which is that it was achieved through nurturing, a mother's maternal instinct to care for her offspring. However, as will be acknowledged shortly in Chapter 5.7 and described in detail in Chapter 6, the problem with this nurturing explanation and why its early permutations were discarded by the scientific establishment is that it has been an unbearably confronting truth. It is only now that we can explain the human condition and thus understand why the present human condition afflicted human race hasn't been able to adequately nurture our infants to the extent their instincts expect, that it becomes safe to finally admit that nurturing is what made us human, that it was nurturing that gave us our moral soul and created humanity. So how did nurturing create our extraordinary, unconditionally selfless moral instincts? Genetic traits for nurturing are intrinsically selfish, which, as has been emphasised, genetic traits normally have to be if they are to survive. Because through our mother's nurturing and fostering of offspring who carry her genes, her genetic traits for nurturing are selfishly ensuring their reproduction into the next generation. However, while nurturing is a genetically selfish trait, from an observer's point of view, it appears to be unconditionally selfless behaviour. The mother is giving her offspring food, warmth, shelter, support and protection for apparently nothing in return. This point is most significant because it means, from the infant's perspective, its mother is treating it with real love, with unconditional selflessness. The infant's brain is, therefore, being trained or indoctrinated or inscribed with unconditional selflessness. And so, with enough training in unconditional selflessness, that infant will grow into an adult who behaves unconditionally selflessly. Apply this training across all the members of that infant's group, and the result is an unconditionally selflessly behaved, cooperative, fully integrated society. The trick in this love indoctrination process lies in the fact that the traits for nurturing are encouraged or selected for genetically, because the better the infants are cared for, the greater are their and their nurturing traits' chance of survival. The process does, however, have an integrative side effect in that the more infants are nurtured, the more their brains are trained in unconditional selflessness. There are very few situations in biology where animals appear to behave selflessly towards other animals. Normally, they each selfishly compete for food, shelter, territory, and mating opportunities. Maternalism, a mother's fostering of her infant, is one of the few situations where an animal appears to be behaving selflessly towards another animal. And it was this appearance of selflessness that exists in the maternal situation that provided the integrative opportunity for the development of love indoctrination, the training of individuals in unconditional selflessness. And with this unconditionally selfless behaviour recurring over many, many generations, the unconditionally selfless behaviour will become instinctive. A moral soul will be established, because genetic selection will inevitably follow and reinforce any development process occurring in a species. The difficulty was in getting the development of unconditional selflessness to occur in the first place, for once it was regularly occurring, it would naturally become instinctive over time. But for a species to develop nurturing, to develop this trick for overcoming the gene-based learning system's seeming inability to develop unconditional selflessness, it required the capacity to allow its offspring to remain in the infancy stage long enough to allow for the infant's brain to become trained or indoctrinated with unconditional selflessness or love. In most species, infancy has to be kept as brief as possible because of the infant's extreme vulnerability to predators. Zebra foals, for example, have to be capable of independent flight almost as soon as they are born, which gives them little opportunity to be trained in selflessness. But as the photo appearing here of a rhesus monkey trying to carry its infant illustrates, walking on three limbs with one arm holding an infant is clearly difficult when not fully bipedal, and suggests the reason for bipedalism. Being semi-upright as a result of their tree living, swinging from branch to branch arboreal heritage, meant primates' arms were largely freed from walking and thus available to hold dependents. Infants similarly had the capacity to latch onto their mothers' bodies. This freedom of the upper body meant primates were especially facilitated for prolonging their offspring's infancy and thus developing love indoctrination. It follows that the longer infancy is delayed, the more and longer infants had to be held, and thus the greater need and, therefore, selection for the arms-freed, upright walking ability known as bipedalism. When I first put forward this nurturing love indoctrination explanations for humans' unconditionally selfless moral nature in a 1983 submission to Nature and New Scientist, see www.humancondition.com/nature, I said, contrary to prevailing views, that it meant bipedalism must have developed early in this nurturing of love process. And, in fact, as will be discussed in more detail shortly, the early appearance of bipedalism in the fossil record of our ancestors is now being found. For instance, in 2012, it was reported that the oldest hominins currently known are Sahelanthropus chadensis, dated to between 6 and 7 million years ago, which the fossil records suggest stood and walked bipedally. But while bipedalism was the key factor in developing nurturing and thus love indoctrination, other influences also played a pivotal role, most notably the presence of ideal nursery conditions. This entailed uninterrupted access to food, shelter and territory, for if any element was compromised or other difficulties and threats from predators excessive, then we can assume there would have been a strong inclination to revert to more selfish and competitive behaviour. The successful nurturing of infants therefore required ample food, comfortable conditions and security from external threats over an extended period. But in addition to these practical factors, to ensure the success of the love indoctrination process, it wasn't enough to simply look after infants. They had to be loved. And so maternalism became about much more than mothers simply protecting, providing for and training their infants in life skills. It became about demonstrably loving them. Significantly, we speak of motherly love, not motherly protection, provision and training. So, in addition to the prerequisites of, firstly, a physiology that facilitated an extended infancy, and secondly, ideal nursery conditions, what was also required for love indoctrination to occur was the presence and influence of more maternal mothers. Of course, the difficulty with selecting for more maternal mothers is that their genes don't tend to endure because their offspring tend to be the most selflessly behaved, too ready to put others before themselves, leaving the more aggressive, competitive and selfish individuals to take advantage of their selflessness. Such selfish opportunism could, however, be avoided if all members of the group were equally well nurtured with love, equally trained in selflessness. This situation being yet another of the delicate conditions that has to be maintained if love indoctrination is to develop. For any breakdown in nurturing within a group that is in the midst of developing love indoctrination could jeopardize the whole situation and see it revert to the old state of the each for his own opportunistic, all-out competition where only dominance hierarchy can bring some peace, selfish genes rule, animal condition. It can be seen, then, that while the development of unconditional selflessness through the love indoctrination process of a mother's nurturing care of her infant was possible, it was not easy. Even for the exceptionally facilitated primates, which explains why none of the primate species apart from our ape ancestors have been able to complete the development of love indoctrination to the point of becoming fully integrated. While, as will shortly be described in Chapter 5.6, bonobos are on the threshold of this achievement, the evidence so far indicates that it has only been our ape ancestors who managed to complete the process, the result of which is our species' unconditionally selfless, genuinely altruistic, universally loving, instinctive self or soul, the voice or expression of which is our moral conscience. Before concluding this section, it is important to note that this love indoctrination process involved an indoctrination or training in unconditional selflessness, not an understanding of it. The search for knowledge still had to take place, which is why the human condition producing clash between our instincts and conscious intellect occurred. The process by which love indoctrination liberated consciousness will be introduced in Chapter 5.8 and fully explained in Chapter 7.